This video examines how significant world events influenced the first wave of post-World War II migration. From Federation to the end of World War I, Australia's population grew slowly from 5 million to 7 million. Most of this growth was a result of natural increase, births outnumbering deaths, but immigration also contributed. The Immigration Restriction Act 1901, also known as the White Australia Policy, limited non-British immigration, thus ensuring a British-dominated culture. A dictation test in English ensured migrants from countries with a non-European culture did not gain entry. Between World War I and World War II, migration to Australia was patchy, even declining during the Depression years of the 1930s. However, growth through natural increase during this period meant that the British-dominated population grew steadily. After the Japanese bombed Darwin in World War II, the Australian government became fearful about our ability to protect our vast national borders with such a small population. They also believed that if Australia was going to develop economically, it would need a larger workforce. The government aimed to create a population boom through a combination of increased births and a massive immigration program. They called this policy Populate or Perish. The Immigration Minister in 1945, Arthur Calwell, proclaimed that without immigration, the future of the Australia we know will be both uneasy and brief. As a nation, we shall not survive. It was recommended that Australia needed to increase its population through increased births and large-scale immigration. Consequently, Australia negotiated agreements with other governments and international organisations to help achieve high migration targets, and migrants who wanted to escape post-war Europe were recruited with the promise of a better life in Australia using posters like this one. The emphasis in this first wave of post-war migration to Australia was on attracting British and Western European migrants. The schemes included offering free or financially assisted passage to all United Kingdom or British residents from England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland, who came to be known as the £10 POMs. Assisted passage for ex-servicemen from certain countries of the British Empire and the United States, and assisted passage for ex-servicemen or resistance fighters from the Netherlands, Norway, France, Belgium and Denmark. In 1947, the Australian government agreed to resettle 12,000 people per year who were displaced or forced to leave their homes during the war in Europe. Formal and informal migration agreements were also made with Malta, Italy, West Germany, Turkey, Yugoslavia, Austria, Greece, Spain and Belgium. The agreements with Italy and West Germany were controversial because Australia had been so recently at war with these countries. The result of the government's migration schemes was exactly what they had intended, a population boom. Between 1945 and 1965, more than 2 million migrants came to Australia. Most were assisted, which meant that the Australian government paid most of their fare to get to Australia. In return, they had to stay in Australia for at least 2 years and work in whatever jobs the government gave them. This graph demonstrates the change to Australia's population characteristics as a result of immigration. In 1946, only 10% of the population was born overseas. After the assisted migration schemes were introduced, the percentage of the population born overseas continued to increase until at least the 1970s, when more than 20% of Australia's total population were migrants. This percentage increased again in the early 2000s, standing at around 27% born overseas in the year 2010. Immigration wasn't the only cause of Australia's population boom. Natural increase was another cause. This graph shows the number of births in thousands in Australia each year between 1901 and 2012. It shows that there have been peaks and troughs. Between 1901 and about 1930, for example, the number of births remained relatively stable. Barring a slight drop during World War I, and during the Depression years of the 1930s. From about 1935 onwards, the overall trend is that the number of births increased rapidly over time. This post-war population boom that Australia experienced due to increased immigration and an increased birth rate was experienced all over the world. The babies born during this time are known as the baby boomers and are now in their 60s and 70s.